On a low green hill in the heart of ancient Phrygia, two trees grow from a single root, an oak and a linden, their trunks leaning together, their branches so tangled that from a distance they look like one living thing embracing itself. Travelers passing that way for centuries tied ribbons to the lowest branches and left small offerings in the grass beneath them, because the old story told in that country said these were not ordinary trees at all, but a husband and wife who had once stood on that very spot as an old and humble house. How does a poor couple's cottage become sacred ground, and how does a marriage end not in a grave but in bark and leaves, still standing side by side after thousands of years? That question sits at the center of one of the warmest and strangest stories to come out of Greek myth, a tale less about gods punishing pride like so many others, and more about two gods testing a whole town and finding that only the poorest house in it still remembered how to be kind. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now settle in and travel back to a rainy evening in Phrygia, when two weary strangers came walking down from the hills, looking for nothing more than a warm hearth and an open door. In the oldest telling, hospitality to strangers was not simply good manners in Greece. It was sacred law, watched over by Zeus himself, because any traveler standing at your door might, in truth, be a god wearing the face of a beggar. Few households ever tested that idea seriously. But one evening in the region of Phrygia, two travelers came walking down out of the high ground as the light failed and a cold rain began to fall. They wore rough, patched cloaks and carried no servants and no gifts, nothing to mark them as anything but poor men far from home. What none of the townspeople guessed was that these were no ordinary beggars at all, but Zeus, king of the gods, and his son Hermes, the swift messenger, walking the earth in disguise to see whether mortals still honored the old law of welcoming a stranger. They went first to the grandest house in the valley, then to the next, and the next after that, knocking door after door as the rain thickened, asking only for a roof and a place by the fire. Every door shut against them. Some households pretended not to hear the knocking, while others looked the ragged strangers over and turned them away without apology, bolting the latch before the travelers had even turned to leave. By the time the two gods reached the last house on the edge of town, night had fully fallen, and not a single family in that prosperous valley had offered them so much as a dry corner to sit in. Past the last grand house, where the road narrowed and the hedges grew wild, stood a hut so small and plain that most travelers would not have looked twice at it. Its walls were mud and woven reeds, patched here and there with clay, and its roof was thatched with marsh grass that had gone gray and thin with age. Here lived an old man named Philemon and his wife Baucis, who had married in that same small house when they were young and had never once, in all the years since, wished to leave it for anything grander. They had grown old together, inside those low walls, poor in everything the town valued: land, coin, fine clothing, and rich only in patience with each other and with the little they had. When the knock came at their door that stormy night, neither of them hesitated the way the wealthier households down the road had. Philemon rose at once from beside the fire, pulled the door open himself, and welcomed the two soaked and shivering strangers inside before he had even asked their names. Baucis was already moving to stir the coals higher and pull out the one bench worth sitting on, brushing it clean with her apron and setting a cushion of soft sedge grass upon its hardest end for the elder-looking guest. It did not occur to either of them to wonder why two travelers had been turned away at every other door in town. It only occurred to them that two strangers were cold and wet, and that they had a fire, however small, to offer. What Baucis and Philemon owned in the way of food was not much, but they gave it without hesitation, and without the faint reluctance that so often creeps into generosity. Philemon fed the coals with dry sticks and blew them into a proper flame, hanging a blackened pot of water above it, while Baucis went out to her small garden patch to cut cabbage leaves still cold with rain. From a beam near the ceiling she took down a strip of smoked bacon, saved for some special occasion that had never quite arrived, and sliced a portion of it into the pot without a second thought. There were eggs, gently coddled in warm ash. There was a little cheese. There was bread, olives, endive root, and radishes pulled fresh from the same small garden. Philemon set a three-legged table before the fire, and when one leg proved shorter than the others and rocked on the packed dirt floor, he wedged a broken piece of pottery beneath it, then wiped the surface with sprigs of fresh mint to sweeten the smell. Baucis brought out their best wine, a thin, homemade vintage, nothing a wealthy household would have bothered pouring, mixed it carefully with water in an earthenware bowl, and set it before their guests along with 2 clay cups that did not quite match. It was, by any measure, a small and humble meal. But it was offered the way a feast should be offered, warmly, completely, and without anyone at that table feeling for a moment that they were receiving anything less than the very best the house had to give. It was Baucis who noticed first. She had refilled the wine bowl twice already, certain each time she poured the very last of it, and yet each time she looked again, the bowl stood full to the brim as though untouched. She said nothing, only watched more closely, refilling the guests' cups from a jug that never seemed to grow lighter in her hand. When she finally caught Philemon's eye across the table, his weathered face had gone pale too. Not wanting to alarm their guests, the old couple drew back and began to whisper to each other in the corner of the room. No ordinary wine behaved that way, and these, Baucis now realized, were no ordinary travelers at all, for they carried a quiet light that had nothing to do with the fire. Frightened that they had offered too little, Philemon hurried out to the little yard where their one goose lived, their only goose, keeper of the small farmyard, the closest thing to a guard dog the old couple owned. He meant to catch it and offer it up, the best thing left in the house to give. But the goose was faster than he expected, darting between his legs and around the woodpile until it fled through the open door and threw itself, wings beating, into the laps of the 2 strangers, who only smiled and told the breathless old man that his goose could live. It was time, they said gently, for the truth to come out. The 2 strangers rose from the bench, and as they rose, the small room seemed to fill with more light than the little fire alone could explain. Gone was the stoop of tired travelers. In its place stood a bearing that made Baucis and Philemon sink to their knees on the dirt floor, understanding at once who had been sitting at their table. Zeus, king of the gods, spoke first, and Hermes, his son, stood quiet and watchful at his shoulder. They had walked the length of that valley in disguise, Zeus told them, knocking on 1,000 doors, and every household but this one had turned them away without so much as a crust of bread. Such coldness toward a stranger could not go unanswered. He told them to leave their house at once, to climb the steep path behind their garden to the nearest hilltop, and not to look back no matter what sounds rose from the valley behind them. Frightened, leaning on each other's arms, the old couple obeyed, climbing through the last of the storm as the sky above them slowly cleared. Behind them, in the valley they had called home for a lifetime, the ground itself seemed to groan, and dark water began rising through the streets of the town that had shut its doors, filling the lanes, climbing the walls of the grand houses that had turned 2 gods away, swallowing field and orchard and rooftop until the whole valley became a single dark, silent lake beneath the clearing stars. Only when they reached the hilltop, breathless and afraid, did Baucis and Philemon dare to turn and look. What Baucis and Philemon saw from the hilltop took the breath from both of them a second time. Where the prosperous town had stood only an hour before, there was nothing now but a wide sheet of dark water, calm and glassy under the returning stars, without a single rooftop or wall left showing above its surface. And where their own small reed-thatched house should have stood, untouched at the water's edge, there rose instead a gleaming marble temple with a golden roof, its walls no longer mud and reed but polished white stone, its roof no longer thin gray thatch but sheets of gold that caught the faint moonlight and threw it back like fire. The wooden posts that had held up their humble porch had become fluted columns. The dirt floor they had swept every morning of their married life had become smooth, cool stone. It was, unmistakably, their home, and yet it had become something built for a god to live in. Zeus turned to the old couple, still trembling and leaning on one another atop the hill, and told them plainly that their kindness had earned them whatever they wished to ask for. As thanks for the welcome, no one else in that valley had thought to offer. Baucis and Philemon did not ask for gold, or youth restored, or a grander house than the temple already glowing before them. They drew close together, spoke quietly as they had spoken to each other for 50 years, and gave the king of Olympus an answer far humbler and far harder to grant than anything he expected to hear. "Let us tend your temple," the old couple said, "for whatever years remain to us. Let us be its keepers, sweeping its floors and tending its altar fire, so that the kindness shown to one traveler might go on being offered to every traveler after. And when the end comes," they asked, "let it come to both of them in the same hour, so neither would be left to bury the other, or learn to live alone after a lifetime spent together." Zeus granted both requests without hesitation. Baucis and Philemon became the priest and priestess of the temple that had once been their home, greeting travelers at its gates the way they had once greeted two ragged strangers at their door, and turning no one away. Years passed. The couple grew older still, their backs bending, their hands slower at the temple's small daily tasks, until one warm evening, standing together on the marble steps as they had once stood at that low cottage door, Philemon noticed leaves sprouting from the ends of Baucis' fingers. Baucis, in the same breath, watched rough bark climbing up her husband's legs and creeping over his shoulders. Neither of them cried out or pulled away. Instead, as the change rose over them, they turned to face each other one last time and called out, in the same instant, the same words of farewell. And then there were no more words, only two trees standing where the couple had stood, an oak and a linden grown from a single spot of ground, their branches already leaning together and intertwining. For generations afterward, people from the towns nearby walked up that hill to see the two trees, tying ribbons and small garlands to their lowest branches in memory of the couple who had stood there. Local farmers pointed them out to their own children, telling the same story told to them, of a night when a whole valley turned two hungry strangers away and only the poorest house among them opened its door. What the gods rewarded in that story was not wealth or beauty or cleverness or even great faith. It was the plain, unglamorous willingness to share a little when there was only a little to share. Baucis and Philemon never became rich. They never asked to be young again, or powerful, or free of the hard, small labor that had filled their whole lives. They asked only to keep doing, for a while longer and then forever, the one thing they had always done without being asked, welcoming whoever appeared at their door and staying together until the end and past it. Perhaps that is why this one has always felt less like a warning and more like a quiet kind of comfort. Proof that the smallest house on the poorest road can still be the one place in the whole valley that gets remembered, long after the grand houses and their locked doors have gone under the water for good. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.